How you guys doing this evening? It is 7 o'clock and we're getting ready to start our next live review, getting ready for the APUSH test next week. We got 5 days until the AP exam. I know you guys are excited. I am. Tonight we are doing time period 7, which goes from 1898 to 1945, specifically going from the beginning of the Spanish-American War all the way to the end of World War II. Now, we are skipping over the Progressive Era, which falls into period 7, but if you were with me last night, I covered that at the end of last night's video and tacked it on to time period 6. Kind of carried the Gilded Age into the Progressive Era. So if you want Progressive Era stuff, go watch that video from last night. All right, so we're going to get right into it because I think I can do this relatively quick tonight, although period 7 is so much fun. So I'm going to try not to get into too many stories, and I'm just going to try to get right to the point. So that means we need to get to the big ideas. So let's go to big idea number 1. And I just realized that I got to reset this. I'm sorry. I made it way too big. Big ideas, way too big. There we go. All right. Big idea number 1. Once the western frontier was settled, the United States debated whether it should expand into territories beyond its border. All right, guys, there's a name you should know that's out there, and that name is Frederick Jackson Turner. Now, Frederick Jackson Turner wrote what is known as the Frontier Thesis, and in this thesis, he basically said that westward expansion, that the frontier is part of America's DNA. It really helps define who we are as Americans, and that without the frontier, there's a question of who we are, and we might question that because the frontier we see is that he saw it as something that was very good for America. He saw it as a hope for America going forward. There was always something. If we were in a bad situation in the cities, or we were having a hit an economic downturn or something like that, there was always hope in the frontier. And so that's what he said was uniquely American, and that's what made us different than every other nationality out there. Well, in 1890, the Census Bureau is going to come out, and they are going to say that the frontier is closed. Not closed like this is closed for the season, come back next year, meaning closed that there is no more frontier. We had settled it all. And I mean, that was the goal of Manifest Destiny, but the question is, if the frontier is closed, now what do we do? Now, where do we go? And that's when this idea of imperialism starts to creep into American vocabulary. The idea of going out into the world and trying to gain more land that way. Now, there was 2 groups of people debating this idea. And fascinatingly enough, they were called the imperialist and the anti-imperialist. Now, the imperialists are going to argue that imperialism going out into the world is just going to be an extension of Manifest Destiny. It's just the natural thing that we're going to do. And they're going to say, they're going to have a lot of good reasons for doing that. They're going to say, look at the government we have. Look at the democracy that we're practicing here. That is way better than any other system out there in the world. And we need to take that out into the world and spread those political ideas, because that would just make the world a better place. There was also this idea of this white man's burden, this racial superiority that, quite honest, we thought we were better than other nationalities. We thought, we could do it better. And so we had this responsibility to go into the world and lift others up to, quote, our level. And then, there's also the faith question about it. Manifest Destiny was this idea that it was God's plan for the United States to expand. And so if it was God's plan to expand in North America, that should also be the case going into the world. Well, the anti-federalists are presenting another side. They're basically saying, wait a minute. Our country is based on this idea of self-determination, that social contract, where you get to choose what type of government you want to have. And the United States going out into the world and imposing our government is not self-determination. No, instead, that's exerting power over maybe weaker foes. And that's kind of the philosophical argument that they're going to make. The realistic argument, they said, is if we go out into the world, we're going to have conflicts with other countries in the world. And we've been working to avoid those conflicts since the beginning of this country. I mean, let's go back to Washington's administration, to the proclamation of neutrality during the French Revolution, and then even a step further during his farewell address where he said, stay out of other countries' business. It's going to cause too much conflict, and we've been living this way for so long, and that's what we really need to do at this point. So this was the debate. And that's going to take us into our next big idea. You have the foundation now. We go to our next big idea, which, oh, look, it changed sizes again. I don't know what's going on, but I can fix it. See, watch that. I do have abilities. It says, the United States victory in the Spanish-American War led to further land acquisitions and transformed America into a proper empire. Well, if you can't tell by the big idea, the imperialists won the argument. And we're going to go in and we're going to start with the Spanish-American War. Now, this is going to happen in 1898. 1898 is one of those big years that a bunch of stuff happened, so you might want to be familiar with some of the big ideas that happened during that time. But the Spanish-American War is going to be a war that we're going to go and declare war on Spain due to some activity that happens down in Cuba with one of our naval battleships. Now, keep in mind, we had our eyes on Cuba since the 1840s. Go back to the Ostend Manifesto, where there was a push, 1840s, maybe early 1850s, but right around that time, a push to actually go to war with Spain to get Cuba into the United States at that point. Well, that didn't happen, but we have seen investments, private investments going into Cuba that happened during Taft's administration, and we're going to actually send a U.S. battleship down there to protect American interest in Cuba when there was actually a Cuban revolt going on at the same time. Not going to get into all the details because I want to talk about the war. And here's what happened. The ship blew up. We blamed Spain, and the press is going to run with that. The yellow journalism of the 1890s is going to basically turn this idea of the battleship Maine sinking into a cause for war. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to declare war against Spain. And that's going to be the Spanish-American War. Now, it really wasn't a very difficult victory for us. We fought it on actually two fronts. We fought down in the Caribbean and Cuba. We also fought this over in the Philippines. The effects of the Spanish-American War are going to actually see this expansion of America into the world, and we actually are building an American empire. So, what land did we get from the Spanish-American War? Well, we got the Philippines. We got some islands in the Caribbean. We got some islands in the Pacific. We got Puerto Rico is going to become a territory for the United States. And, I'm sorry, this cough is kind of bad tonight. And this is going to all open up the idea for Hawaii coming in as well. The island of Hawaii. Now, Hawaii wasn't part of the Spanish-American War, but Hawaii is very important to us because it's like the halfway point between the United States and the Philippines. And so we need that for like a refueling station. So when the opportunity presents itself, when the planters of Hawaii actually take control and overthrow the government there, and they come to the U.S. government and said, hey, let us in, we're like, okay. And so Hawaii enters into American, territorial expansion in 1898 as well. Now, you would think everybody would be, fat and happy that the United States is now in control of all these areas, but there were some places that they weren't that happy we were there. In fact, there's going to be a major revolt in the Philippines. Aguinaldo is going to lead rebels against the United States. So, don't think that American imperialism just brings about all this happy feelings and everyone, stardust and unicorns dancing around. No, I mean, you're going to have some pushback from it as well. But what's going to happen now is going into the 20th century, America is now a player in the world. We're not this isolated nation trying to keep to ourselves, okay? All right, here we go. Big idea number 3. We only got 11 big ideas tonight, guys, so I'm sure we're going to get out of here a little earlier. All right. Now remember, I'm skipping over the progressive era. So, big idea number 3. Although the U.S. began in a position of isolationism regarding World War I, mounting pressure brought them into the war. And the U.S. entry turned the tide of the war for the Allies. You know, we as the United States, you're going to find going into the 20th century, or in this time period, we have this idea that we start as isolationism, and then we go into let's get involved in the world, and then once we go and do make our mark on the world, we come back. We want to be isolated for a while, and then we go back into the world to make another mark, and then we want to come back and be isolated. And that's what's going to kind of happen here. After the Spanish-American War, after we obtained all this, all these new territories and lands and stuff, we kind of wanted to go back to isolationism, because what's going to start happening is trouble is going to start brewing over in Europe, and we really don't want anything to do with it. World War I is going to get started, and America is going to do its best to completely stay out of it. You will have some, banks loaning money. You will have factories making weapons that are going to be sold to the belligerent powers over there. But the United States government as a whole wants to stay completely out of the war. But we're going to find that we can't stay out of the war. And there's going to be several key reasons that we enter into World War I. The first one is going to be the unrestricted submarine warfare being used by the Germans. Now, a lot of people want to say that one major thing that led us into the war was the sinking of a cruise ship. You see, these German subs were attacking merchant ships in the Atlantic Ocean, but then they sunk a British cruise ship, the Lusitania. Now, there was a British ship, but there were over 120 Americans on board that ship who were going to lose their life. And that's going to lead a lot of people to calling for the United States to enter the war. But we don't go in yet. Because what's going to happen is Germany's going to issue what's called the Sussex Pledge, where they promise not to hit any more passenger ships, or for that matter, any neutral merchant ships. That ain't going to last. And what's going to start happening is they are going to start sinking American merchant ships, even though we're neutral and we're flying the flag of neutrality. They're not respecting our freedom of the seas, and they start sinking our ships. This is starting to churn the waters more for the United States entering into this war. I think the straw that broke the camel's back is what's known as the Zimmerman Note, or the Zimmerman Telegram. And what that was is Germany is going to try to entice Mexico to invoke a war against the United States to keep us out of Europe. Basically tie us up over here. And in doing so, Germany doesn't have to worry about another allied force coming in, because Germany, quite honestly, is not doing too good at this point, and they need all the help they can get. When the Zimmerman telegram is intercepted, that's when Wilson is going to ask for a declaration of war, and America is going to enter into World War I officially. We don't get boots on the ground right away. But what you're going to see during this time is you're going to see the United States go into this war, and they're going to go into this war with the sole purpose. When Wilson entered into Congress to ask for the declaration of war, the reason he gave was we needed to go out into the world and make the world safe for democracy. We were seeing, some, self-determination was being taken away from some of these countries and stuff. So he said, that's why we're going to fight. War is declared. We're getting ready to go. And we're going to come. I always tell my students that we enter into World War I kind of halfway through the fourth quarter. We're coming in right at the end. But us coming into the end is going to give the Allied forces that final push they need. They're going to get, obviously troops. They're going to get supplies. They're going to get weapons. And that's going to give them the final push they need to get over the top to defeat Germany. We're going to send what we call our fighting force, the American Expeditionary Force. About 1 million men are going to go over under the command of John Blackjack Pershing. And like I said, our entry into the war tips the scales into the favor of the Allies, and that's going to lead to the victory over in Europe. Now, here at home, we're also going to get involved. And let's look at big idea number 4. Big idea number 4 says that U.S. involvement in World War I meant leveraging all of its assets at home. Additionally, it created the occasion for the suppression of civil liberties, nativism, and significant migrations. So let's start breaking that down a little bit. Going into war, America at home takes this posture known as total war. We go into this posture of total war, which means every aspect of society is focused on winning this war. Our factories are going into wartime production. We go into rationing. We plant victory gardens. Everything we do is put in place to help the United States go in and win this war. It's interesting because a lot of what we do during this time kind of ties back to that progressive era that I talked about last night, this idea of scientific management. We talked about Taylor, and he came up with these procedures to make factories and government run more efficiently. And now those principles are going to be used as we not only prepare for war, but as we fight the war. And we're going to see the government centralize everything around the power of government. We're either going to centralize the pricing. They're going to control prices of goods. They're going to control all the raw materials. They're going to control the railroads in our country. Everything is going to have this centralized control, and it's all going to be focused around wartime production. What this does, it's going to revitalize industry, obviously, because, all these factories are up running at 100% and everything. And you're also going to see a major migration of people during this time. A lot of people are going to start moving from the rural areas into the cities. We talk about movement, in our class we talked about immigration and migration the other day. This is another example of that, of a huge migration of people going from the rural areas into the cities because of all the jobs that are being produced because of the fact that we were in wartime production. So the jobs going up, that's a great thing. Some of the stuff we did, though, during the war, not so great. Let's talk about your civil liberties during war, because a lot of times during wartime, Americans' freedoms seem to kind of dissipate a little bit, all in the name of protecting the security of the United States. Basically, and a lot of it, we can go all the way back to John Adams' presidency, the second president of the United States. You remember how much grief we gave him for the Alien and Sedition Acts? And, that was unconstitutional, and I can't believe he did that. He took away the freedom of speech from people just because they wanted to say something negative about the government. Well, guess what happens during World War I? The Espionage is going to be passed. And the Espionage Act basically made it a crime to criticize the government. Interesting. Where was the law? Where's all the yelling and screaming about Wilson and the idea that, they took away Americans' freedom of speech? Well, they actually had a Supreme Court case about it. It was called Schenck versus the United States. Schenck is one of those cases you need to know. So Schenck versus the United States, where basically the Supreme Court said that government can censor speech if they sense a clear and present danger to the security of our country. And so basically, this idea of suppression of civil liberties is going to be a constant as we go through history in our wars. Kyle, that's a fantastic question. Would I say the developments in World War I and II at home are similar? Absolutely similar. And in fact, I'm going to mention that when I get to that big idea. There, you could almost go, word for word. You see the same approach to the war in World War II that you see in World War I. And Andrew, the Great Migration, the migration I'm talking about during World War I includes the Great Migration. When we talk about the Great Migration, we're primarily talking African Americans moving to the north. Now, they were part of this migratory movement during World War I, but that's going to continue a little bit into the early 1920s. But so I guess I don't know if the migration of Americans from rural to city is a subset of the Great Migration, or the Great Migration is a subset of the other one. But whenever you talk about the Great Migration, and Andrew, I know we did that short answer in class the other day, that's predominantly just African Americans moving to the... All right, so the Sedition Act is another act that's going to be passed in 1918 that deals with civil liberties. And again, it's going to attack Americans' right to criticize the government. You can't write about the government in negative ways. You can't talk about them. So, the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, very similar to what we saw with the Sedition Act under John Adams. And Schenck versus the United States, the Supreme Court said It's okay, because we're in clear and present danger. We're in war. And you know what I say about our government and people? Whenever we think there's something to be afraid of, our government uses that to kind of suppress our rights and stuff. So just that there's my little editorial for the night. All right, another big thing that's going to happen affecting civil liberties during this time is going to be the Red Scare. This is going to be the first Red Scare. Now, right smack in the middle of World War I, you're going to have the Russian Revolution in 1917. And what we're going to see in there is the government there, the Tsar, is going to be overthrown, and a communist government is going to come in. And we are afraid in America that some of these immigrants who had come over from that area are going to influence America and actually try to suppress the American government and bring in a similar communist style of government. And so that's going to lead to the Red Scare. And the biggest characteristic, or what you should recognize as the Red Scare, is the Palmer raids. Palmer was the Attorney General of the United States, and they are going to basically start going out and raiding different areas, raiding businesses, raiding social clubs, raiding different areas where they felt that there was a growth of the idea of socialism or anarchy and stuff like that. This is, I guess if you wanted to compare, you could compare the Palmer raids to McCarthyism of the 1950s. I mean, kind of the same idea. They're seeking out those they feel could subvert our government at this time. During the first Red Scare, during the Palmer raids, what you're going to see is people arrested, and you're going to see a lot of people deported and kicked out of the United States, because we feared, like I said, that they would introduce this, this socialist idea and anarchy and stuff like that. So there you go. And here we go. Here are my notes, and I told you it was coming. The Great Migration is taking place at this point. Now, Andrew, I'm going to kind of go back to your question, because when I talked about the migration during World War I, I talked about people from rural society moving to the city. During the Great Migration, African Americans are absolutely moving to the city as well, but a lot of it is they're moving out of the South. So most are going to cities, no doubt about it, but you do have some also going west, kind of along the lines like the Exodusters and stuff that we talked about last night, and they are trying to escape the persecution of the South. That's a lot of their motivating factors. So I guess white people, white Americans, their driving force is they're being pulled to the cities for jobs, whereas as African Americans are being pulled to the cities for jobs, but they're also being pushed by the persecution that's being felt down in the southern states. Now, I'll be very clear. As these African Americans start to move into the city, they're not going to face all, the unicorn and pixie dust all over again. I mean, life is hard. There's still racism in the country. They're still facing that with regards to housing and stuff. And we're actually going to see some race riots following World War II in the early 1920s due to as an effect of the Great Migration. But this is all kind of going on during this time, okay? So now let's get to big idea number 5. Here we go. Let me change my screen. Big idea number 5. In the 1920s, new technologies focused the U.S. economy on the production of consumer goods, which improved standards of living and spread a national culture. All right, guys, we're getting into the roaring 20s now. And these are always fun to talk about. Now, remember, I talked about it last night. The 19th or 18th Amendment has been passed. That's the Prohibition Amendment. And so we're going into the 1920s, a, quote, dry country. Alcohol is illegal. But our country is booming. We're booming coming out of the war. We're going to see, because of the increased productivity, that's going to continue, into the 1920s. We're going to see new energy technology being introduced that's going to allow us to grow even more. And finally, government policies are going to change with regards to business. That's also going to encourage growth. So let's look a little bit at some of this stuff. I talked about increased productivity. Something was introduced going into the 1920s under that scientific management, again, the most efficient way to do business, the most efficient way to run a factory, and Henry Ford is going to introduce the assembly line. And the assembly line, as you guys know, you just stand in one spot and you have one job. And if you're building a car, your job is to put the front bumper on. And so every time the chassis comes by, you and probably a partner on this other side take the bumper, stick it on, screw the bumper on, and the chassis moves on. Another one comes up, you pick up a bumper, screw it on, and it moves on. And that becomes the assembly line process becomes natural in all these factories. And so production numbers are going to go up. We're going to see a huge increase in production, which you know is going to lead to a huge increase in consumerism as well. Another thing that's going to add to this, that's going to help with production, is these new energy technologies that are coming in. Oil is going to, refined oil, is coming out of the Gilded Age. Rockefeller is going to introduce that. Electricity. And so our factories are going to be able to not have to worry about light from the, windows or kerosene lamps and stuff. They're going to be able to, open and run different shifts at different times into the night. And so, man, if you're open all the time, that means you're producing all the time. And so if you want to make money, that's how you're going to do it. So energy, this energy technology is also going to play a role. Finally, government policy. Now, we saw during the progressive era, we saw a lot of regulation and stuff come in with regards to when the muckrakers were showing all the ills of society and the ills of business at this time. Going into the 1920s, you're going to see the government start to back off again. Now, we're not going to go into full laissez-faire like we had in the Gilded Age, but we're getting pretty close. The government is backing off on the regulations. They're backing off on, oversight and stuff like that. And under Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of Treasury under Harding and then Coolidge, we're going to see a lot of corporate tax cuts. And that's going to allow, when corporations get tax cuts, they have a tendency to reinvest that money back into their business and start growing it even more. And so all of this is going to spur growth going into the 1920s. And America is feeling good. 1920s, it's party time. We're having fun and all this other stuff. On top of that, guys, we're defining our culture. And we're doing that through new forms of communication, new forms of media. The radio and movies are going to be introduced during the 1920s. And we looked at those, and all of a sudden, all Americans were listening to the radio. All Americans were going to the movies. And what we started seeing happen is a culture was presented. The ideal American culture is going to be presented in these movies and on these radio shows and stuff. And Americans are going to start trying to fit into that mold, if you will. So it's kind of like, you go and watch a movie and you see how the, quote, normal American family lives. And you're like, well, that's how I got to be living. And so I'm going to start moving my life towards being like what I saw in the movie or what I heard on the radio. And so our nation is going to kind of start coming together in what we had this vision of, the perfect American lifestyle. And that's what people are starting to try to attain to. And one way they do that is, through all this consumerism and purchasing all these new goods and stuff like that. And they're going to start buying stuff on credit because that's going to become the American way of life. Don't get me started on that, guys. Stay away from credit. Credit bad, even today, okay? All right, so that's the culture, and that's a culture that's being created during the 1920s. Now, we can get in and we can talk about, women and stuff like that, and I'll touch on them a little bit later, but of course we have the rise of the flappers and everything like that. So all of that's going on in the 1920s. But and let me go, and that just leads me right into big idea number 6. Yay! Big idea number 6, the urbanization of America granted new opportunities for women and immigrants, gave rise to new forms of art, and emphasized regional differences. There's that regional differences again. We've been dealing with that, for quite some time now. We still deal with it today a little bit, I think. But let's talk about it. In the 1920s, over half of America lived in the cities. I mean, we saw that migration during that time. So half of America lived in the cities. And though women still were expected to live under this cult of domesticity, I introduced that to you last night, this sphere of influence over the home is where they're supposed to be. There's also more opportunities for women in the cities for jobs and for opportunities that they're not going to get in the rural communities. So you still have that cult of domesticity at home, but then you're seeing the rise of some new opportunities. And remember, in the 1920s, women also have the right to vote. That was the 19th Amendment that was passed during the Progressive era. So while they're still expected to follow a certain role, jobs are going to be opening up for them. Secretarial jobs, teaching jobs, stuff like that. Let me backtrack just a little bit. Women did work in the factories during World War I. We don't really see a huge impact from that as like compared to World War II, because World War I was much shorter as far as the time frame. When we get to World War II, you're going to see women and their role in the factories. I mean, they're there for almost 5 years. So that's a little bit of a difference there. But in the 1920s, like I said, jobs at retail, secretarial, teaching, stuff like that. Those are jobs that are starting to open up for women during this time. Immigrants, let's talk about immigrants during the 1920s, because we had seen these large waves of immigrants coming in. And in the 1920s, we're going to institute 2 immigration control laws. In 1921 and 1924, the Emergency Quota Act of 21, and then that's going to be revised to the National Origins Act of 1924. And basically what they're going to do is they're going to set limits on the number, on the number of immigrants that can come from each region of the world based on census numbers of the past. And the whole purpose of these immigration acts were to try to limit the number of immigrants coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe, those hotbed areas for socialism and communism. We're trying to prevent them from coming in. However, there were job opportunities for immigrants during this time. And it's the same story that we've always heard. Immigrants would typically work for less money. And so if people went on strike, if laborers went on strike, immigrants could usually fill in that scab role, and they could find a job quickly doing that. I also said that we're going to see art and literature and music start to change during this time, and you're going to see some writers coming out. Writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and they're referred to as the lost generation, because what they're going to be writing about is basically the downside of society, what happened during the war and the effect that had on them and stuff like that. And so, that's when the book, The Great Gatsby is going to come out during this time and everything. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have read that in your English classes. So this is when those books were being written. What I really want to talk about with regards to art literature is what's happening up in New York, up in Harlem. And this is a direct effect of that Great Migration that I talked about earlier, and that's going to be the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance is going to be a celebration of the African American culture. And you're going to see new music like jazz start to come out, and writings from people like Langston Hughes, and people are going to kind of start embracing this culture. The music. And when you think of the music, think of Louis Armstrong and was it Dizzy Gillespie? I think that was his name. I'm not sure. I might got that name wrong. But this jazz starts to sweep the country, and the Harlem Renaissance actually becomes somewhat part of the American culture. I mean, jazz absolutely does, and stuff like that. So you're going to see that start to take place. But you're also going to see some challenges, some conflicts, some crisis of values occurring during the 1920s, and it's existing completely over religion, specifically the Protestants. Here's a quick question. Anti-immigration feelings centered around the Red Scare or part of the opposition? I think both is the simple answer on this, Andrew, is that they were absolutely centered on the Red Scare, but it just depends on the situation you were in. Like you were anti-immigrant, the nativist. It didn't really matter if it was the Red Scare or the fact that they were taking our jobs. We just wanted them out of here. I mean, so it was just, I always see it in outline form. And so in the outline form, the heading would be getting rid of the immigrants, and the subheadings would be the reasons. So Red Scare, undercutting our jobs, the cultural centers in our cities that they're creating, all that and that. So it all ties together during this time period. It's just the Red Scare presents one more reason why nativists were so against them at that point. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question. So I want to talk about this crisis of faith that we had, and it's basically a division within the Protestant religion, and it's a division between the modernist and the fundamentalist. And you had these two groups, and the debate is over the idea of the theory of evolution. I'm referring to the Scopes monkey trial. Now, this is going to be, like I said, the modernists are going to look at the Bible loosely, look at, saying, that the intent of the word, and, maybe the gray area of the word of God and stuff like that, where the fundamentalists are going to say, no, the word of God is inerrant. There are no errors. What it is what it is. And it's simple as that. And so as a comparison, modernists would say, well, the Bible says the world was created in 6 days, but what does 6 days really mean? Maybe 6 days is 600 days in God's time or something like that, where the fundamentalists are going to say, it says 6 days, dude. Bro, if it says 6 days, it's 6 days. And just go with it, okay? And so all of this is going to come to a head in this Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee, where a substitute teacher was accused of a crime for teaching the theory of evolution in a science class. And you're going to have the two big lawyers of the nation, Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, and they're going to go head to head. And in the outcome, what's going to happen is that the fundamentalists were basically had a hard time in defending their faith. Not defending their faith into what they believed and stuff, but defending faith. Like, how do I defend faith? How do I prove that faith exists? Stuff like that. And so the modernists are going to come out and declare kind of a victory here with that. But it does create a crisis in our country, and it shows a division that, though it's not going to, lead to like another civil war or anything, it's showing that we're not all necessarily following the same culture and stuff like that. Okay? All right, so now let's go on to big idea number 7. We're moving. My goodness, look at this. All right, big idea number 7. The Great Depression caused policymakers to transform the United States into a limited welfare state with the New Deal, and further defined the goals of modern American liberalism. All right, here we go. 1920s, man, things were going good, but what goes up has to come down. And in 1929, the stock market is going to crash, and that's going to launch us into the Great Depression. Now, the stock market was not the primary cause of the Great Depression. It is just the catalyst that kicked us in there. The causes of the Great Depression were shaky banking methods, people buying on margin, too much credit, dropping land values. All of that is going to, it was the perfect storm economically. And so we go into the 1930s, and Herbert Hoover was basically kind of a laissez-faire, hands-off type of president who said, the economy, the market will correct itself. And, and we need to let the market correct itself. But FDR is going to run on the idea is, while we're waiting for the market to correct itself, people are suffering. And so we have to have a plan. And FDR is going to come in with this plan called the New Deal. And he believed that the government should absolutely intervene in the economy. And he is going to use what's known as Keynesian economics, which means the government has to spend money to get our economy to grow, basically. So it's kind of like priming the pump. We're going to pump money into the economy, and through that, the economy will start to grow. Now, the New Deal was based on the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief for the unemployed, for those who don't have jobs. You're going to see the alphabet soup agencies start to pop up. One of them is the Public Works Administration. This would be a group of giving jobs to Americans to go build infrastructure, roads and canals, bridges, all that other stuff. You're going to have the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, are going to go out and work in natural forests and stuff like that, cleaning paths and creating trails and stuff for people to follow. And so you're going to have these different agencies to put people back to work right away. And then you have the recovery and reform. And recovery, how do we get our businesses to start growing again? And how do we fix the systems that were in place that have failed? So you're going to see the things you probably need to know. I mean, I could start listing off all sorts of different agencies, and you might want to review some of those agencies during the Great Depression and during the New Deal. But the big one probably is the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act was the act that's going to set a banking holiday. They're going to close the banks and then reopen the banks with that federal seal of approval, meaning that the federal investigators or federal inspectors are going to go in. They're going to make sure everything is running smoothly on the bank and that the people's deposits are secure. And when they reopen the doors, that's telling Americans, hey, guess what? You can put your money in this bank. It's going to be fine. Add to that the FDIC, the Federal Depository Insurance Corporation, where the federal government is now going to say, we will back deposits. We're going to put insurance on all the deposits in the bank up to a certain level. And as time has changed, the amount of money that the federal government will insure has gone higher and higher based on the economy at the time. But I think at the time they said we'll insure it up to $50,000. I might be wrong on that number, but basically it says you can have up to $50,000 in your bank account, and if this bank fails, you're still going to get your money. And that's what the FDIC is going to guarantee. And then, of course, the other big, long-lasting government intervention that we still have today, and that's going to be the Social Security Act, where workers are going to start paying into a national pension fund. And so every check you get, you probably will, if those of you who work, you see a little line that says FICA. That is Social Security tax, and that's you paying into the system. The challenge of the Social Security Act today is that we have more retirees than we do workers. So we're not getting that funded the way it should. But that's going to be your problem to deal with, young people, because I'm sure that you guys will get great jobs and cover my retirement, as I've talked to you about in class before. So stay in school, get a good job, okay? So that's the Great Depression and what's going on there. And the New Deal, and in my opinion, the New Deal carried us through the Great Depression. It didn't solve the Great Depression because at the beginning, when FDR comes into office, we're at a 20% unemployment. It dips a little bit, but by the time we're getting to about 1940, it's starting to go up again. It's around 19%. So basically think of the New Deal as a boat just floating on the river. It's getting us across the river, but it's not really getting us to where we need to be. There's nothing propelling it, if you will. It's just the boat is just floating. So let's go ahead and look at what got us out of the Great Depression as we talk about big idea number 8. Before entering World War II, the U.S. publicly maintained its traditional isolationism while simultaneously aiding the Allied efforts. But the U.S. entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor. All right, World War II, here we go. As I said, we go through these periods where we're out in the world and then we're isolated. Then we're out in the world isolated. So coming out of World War I, we went back to some isolationist policies. And going into the 1940s, while World War II is building up over in Europe, we're kind of keeping to ourselves over here. But FDR recognized we're going to have to get involved in this war. We're going to have to help our allies sooner rather than later. Now, Congress is going to pass a series of neutrality acts based on the Nye Committee. This was a committee that investigated why we went into World War II, or World War I, excuse me, and they're going to say what pulled us into World War I was our banks were loaning money to belligerents, our factories were building weapons and selling them to belligerents, and so we were already invested in World War I. So the neutrality acts were set up so none of that would happen again. It made it illegal for banks to loan money to nations at war. It made it illegal for factories to sell weapons to nations at war. Well, what's going to happen is FDR is going to go to Congress towards the end of the 1930s and say, our ally over there, England, is needing some help, so we need to loosen up some of these neutrality acts. And so what they're going to pass is the cash and carry system and the lend-lease system. Now, the cash and carry, very simple. It says that if you have money, you can come and buy whatever you want from the United States. And as long as you pay cash and as long as you put it on your ships and you transport it over to Europe, it's all good. Now, they didn't put any conditions. It could be belligerent forces. It could be people fighting in the war. But in all reality, at this point, it wasn't like World War I where you had the German U-boats controlling a lot of the Atlantic. The British Navy controlled the Atlantic at this point. So it's going to be the British who are going to take advantage of the cash and carry, and they're going to use that. But as they're fighting in the war, they're going to start running out of money. And that's where the Lend-Lease program comes in. And what we're going to do is we're going to start lending and leasing equipment to the British military and the British government in order for them to continue to be able to fight this war. Now, what's eventually obviously going to pull the United States into the war will be the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan was one of the Axis powers at war, fighting with Germany and Italy. They are going to launch an attack on the United States on December 7th, 1941. Please know that date. December 7th, 1941. The Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor, and that's going to pull the United States into the war. And so that's going to take us to big idea number 9. And here we are right here. You guys mentioned this before. The required mobilization for the U.S. entry into World War II transformed the American society economically while creating the occasion for a violation of civil liberties. Man, does that sound familiar? Man, I think I just talked about that about 10 minutes ago with World War I. What we're going to see is going into World War II, we are going to see huge increases in government spending. And I mean, that just falls right into that Keynesian economics policy of the more the government spends, the more the economy grows. FDR is also going to put a chink in the unemployment when he is going to draft nearly 1 million men for the armed forces to, to prepare them to fight. Now, this was about a year before we entered into the war. We're going to shift all our factories back to wartime production. We're going to open factories that have been closed due to the Great Depression. Factories that were producing, cars are now producing tanks, and factories that were making pinball machines are now producing bullets and everything like that. And we're going back into that idea of total war, where the entire economy is focused on war production. But again, civil liberties are going to take a back seat during World War II. This time, though, it's going to be a certain group of people. Executive Order 9066, FDR is going to sign off on in 1942, in which we legally inter or imprison Japanese American citizens. Japanese Americans mostly living on the West Coast are going to be forced into internment camps because we were afraid of spies amongst them. Let me reiterate, Japanese Americans. These were American citizens. These weren't, immigrants coming in that we were concerned about. They were American citizens, some of them second, third generation. And we're putting them in internment camps. Again, a court case is going to come up saying you can't do that. That's going to be Korematsu versus the United States. And in this case, once again, the U.S. Supreme Court says during wartime, there are necessary things that the government must do to protect the American people from danger, whether that danger existed or not. And that's what's going to happen here with the Japanese American citizens. Okay? I'm not going to go much more into, this big idea because, like I said earlier, it pretty much mirrors what happened in World War I. Obviously, women are going to be working in the factories again. You're going to see Rosie the Riveter. She's going to be the shining example of women doing their part for the war effort. And like I said earlier, the difference this time, women are going to be working for 3 or 4 years before the men come home. So they're going to have much more of an impact on this war than they did on World War I. Not to take away from World War I, but this one, women really took on the role. Just a side note, this has nothing to do, and this won't be on your exam at all, but I always find it interesting. I like to share it. Another group of people all of a sudden have a new role in society as well. You're going to see teenagers. The teenage or the teenage generation is all of a sudden going to come alive during this period. It's not that teenagers didn't exist before, but they weren't like their own subsection. And during World War II and going into the 1950s, they're going to become a subsection of America. So we'll talk more about that probably in our next unit. But let's continue on, because I'm closing in on that 1 hour, and I thought I was going to be under an hour tonight. So here we go. Big idea. Number 10. Once the U.S. committed to war, Americans saw the war as a survival of democracy and freedom against fascist totalitarianism. All right, so what's going to happen when we fight this war is coming out of it. Well, let's just talk about it. You know, fighting the war, we fought on a two-front war. We had the European theater. We were fighting over in Europe. And you had the Pacific theater. So we were fighting over in the Pacific as well. So we're basically fighting the Germans in Europe, and we're fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. So it's a two-front war. Now, during the Tehran Conference of the Big Three, it was agreed that the United States would focus a lot of its efforts first in Europe. And then once Europe was handled, then they would turn to Japan, and the Soviet Union would help us fight in the Pacific. So going into fight in Europe, we start in Africa, and then we're going to come up through Sicily, go through Italia, or to Italy. And the biggest, I guess, the major turning point of World War II is going to be the D-Day invasion. June 6, 1944 is the date. And this is going to be the largest amphibious attack in world history. And what we're going to do is we're going to invade France. We're going to be able to push back the Germans out of France. So we're going to liberate France. As we continue to move on, we'll then move into Germany. And at the same time, the Soviets are coming from the east, pushing the Germans back. And we basically have them sandwiched in. And Germany will fall. And that will be the end of the war in Europe. At the same time, once the war ends in Europe, Americans start hearing about some of the atrocities that were happening in the European theater. And I'm speaking of the Holocaust. And we discovered that, when we discovered that nearly 6 million Jewish people are going to be killed in this war just because they're Jewish and for no other reason, it's really going to strengthen America's resolve that we absolutely did the right thing when we went into this war, when we gave up on those isolationist ideals and got involved and didn't just go and fight against Japan, but fought in Europe as well. When we saw what happened, we said we did the right thing, and it kind of solidified that we believed we needed to stay in the world. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, with regards to the Pacific Theater, going over there, the major turning point, honestly, is going to be earlier than D-Day. It's going to be the battle at Midway, where through our code talkers, which were Navajo Indians who were who operated the code, which was never able to be broken during the World War II, we're going to be able to suppress the idea that we found out that the Japanese were planning on attacking Midway. And so their surprise attack was not much of a surprise at all, and we are going to hand it to them. And they're going to lose several carriers and an island nation. I think they only had like 11 carriers total, maybe, or something like that. And we took out like 3 or 4 of them. So that's really going to hurt their Navy. And then we're going to institute what's known as the island hopping campaign. This is in the key concepts, the words, island hopping campaign. So you need to know this strategy with regards to the war in the Pacific. And the idea was that the United States or the Allied troops are going to hop from island to island and basically start to surround the Japanese stronghold islands. And so there's no supplies that are able to get to them. And we're actually going to start taking control of different sections of the Pacific through this island hopping campaign, and it's just going to weaken the Japanese. But what's going to bring the war to the end, the final war, the Japanese war, is going to be the introduction of the atomic bomb. We are going to, through the Manhattan Project, create the world's first atomic bomb, and we're actually going to drop 2 of them in Japan. One on Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945, and a second one in Nagasaki on August 9th, I believe, of that, just a couple days later. And that's going to bring us to the end of World War II. And it's going to elevate us as a nation, as part of the world. And so, I just realized I'm going to pause for a second because I don't think I talked about, and correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't talk about how at the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson was going to be working to get a League of Nations created during that time. And I'm sorry, guys. As soon as I was thinking about going to this last big idea, I realized I never touched on when we went to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. Woodrow Wilson was carrying over his 14 points. His 14 points for what could create a world that would exist in peace. And the major point, I guess his baby and all that, was a League of Nations. But when the League of Nations is going to be presented to the U.S. Congress, because of our fear of getting pulled into different conflicts, where we couldn't say no, we are actually going to not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, therefore not ratify the League of Nations. And I can tie this now to going into big idea number 11. And big idea number 11 says this: the war-ravaged condition of Asia and Europe and the dominant U.S. role in the Allied victory and post-war peace settlements allowed the United States to emerge from the war as the most powerful nation in the world. Now, what's going to happen is at the Yalta conference, I believe it is that the big three are going to start talking about a world organization similar to the League of Nations, and that organization is going to be the United Nations. And the United Nations is going to be set up with a Security Council, which will have veto power over any major decisions that are going to be made. In the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China will make up the Security Council. So again, United States, Great Britain, France, Soviet Union, and China. That is the Security Council on the United Nations at the time. And so what's going to happen is we're not going to have to worry about being pulled into conflict that we don't want to be involved in, because we'll have that veto power. But what's going to happen coming out of World War II, and this is going to guide us into time period 8, is the United States is absolutely going to become the most powerful nation in the world. And we're going to have to be, because we're going to be going up against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of time period 7. And check it out, I did it under an hour. But that means I just have time for more questions if you guys have them. So what kind of questions do you guys have that I can answer about anything from the Spanish-American War to World War I, to World War II? I mean, I'll even answer questions about the Progressive Era if you have anything from last night. So if you have any questions, while I refresh myself, why don't you guys go ahead and put them in the chat there for me? Silence. Guys, have noticed how good the dogs have been tonight, right? I gave them a bone, and now they're both sleeping. So this is a good night. It's a very good night. Do you need to know the exact number 9066 for restricting? No. I would say as long as you can define it, Kyle, you'll be fine. A lot of times, with terms and stuff, especially if you're writing, if you can give a concise definition of what you're talking about, if you don't remember the term name, that's perfectly fine. I mess up that number all the time too. So if you don't remember 9066, you're perfectly fine with that. I'll also go ahead and give you a hint too. If you're writing and you know the time period, but say you don't know the exact year. Say you don't remember the exact year that World War I was fought in. So you don't remember it was 1941 to 1945, but you know it was in the 40s. Say in the 1940s, World War II was fought. That way you're not wrong. Now, so if you don't know a date, don't try to fake your way through it. Just define the era. You can even use presidencies. During the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, World War II was fought. That's perfectly fine as well. But when you start trying to put dates and stuff, it's not that they're going to just completely kick your essay out and say no good, but it just sounds better. I tell you as a reader, I'd rather see someone not know the year but define the era versus try to BS their way through, and try to show that they know something that they don't. The scientific management concept was a huge boost for economic production. But would there be a theoretical objection to this practice? Not really, because what that's a great question. I don't know of any objections to the practice other than unless when it was practiced in the government, you had people who might have wanted a job that then now they're not going to be able to get it because the government has streamlined a lot of it. And so you might see some pushback there because you do have areas they want big government, and big government means has a completely different meaning to some versus others. But with regards to maybe workers, I mean, not as many jobs will be available. But during this time, Joseph, there were so many jobs. I mean, the economy was booming, so you're not going to have that kind of pushback. It is going to lead to some very boring jobs. I'm not going to lie about that. I mean, how many times can you put a wheel on a car? I mean, but that's what happened. But because of the efficiency, though, it's also going to drive down prices. That's going to help as well. So I don't know of any particular group, though, that's going to push back from it. But that's a great question, though. I might have to look into that a little bit further. So. Look at this. 5 questions I've gotten tonight. I mean, that's like a new record, I think. Was there a time when American passive life and views were the most unified and similar? I would say yes, Andrew, in the 1920s and then later in the 1950s. I think we had this picture, and if I'm understanding your question correctly, we had this picture of what American life is going to look like. Especially, I mean, when you're going into the 1950s, you have that idea of conformity. And conforming to the norm and conforming to the cultural norms and stuff. So the 1950s, but absolutely. The 20s, though, you can also make that argument. There's a lot of similarities between the 1920s and the 1950s, both time periods coming out of, a great war, both time periods experiencing an economic boost, both time periods experiencing, new technologies and stuff. So yeah, absolutely. I think those are the 2 time periods that I would absolutely, focus in on. What else you guys got? I'm excited that I finished in under an hour because that means I get to reward myself with ice cream tonight. That was if I said if I finish my part by 8, I'd get ice cream. So, but your part that doesn't negate my ice cream tonight. Not that I need it. All right, I'm not seeing anything else come in. I think I've set a pretty decent time. I actually, I don't know if Cash is watching tonight, but I did change the latency and I did see a difference in that. So thank you for that. But other than that, I think that's going to do it for this evening. Oh yeah, ice cream. Yeah, Harley, you have no idea. I think I told you guys about how crushed I was during Snowmageddon when my ice cream melted. Everything else stayed fine, but I lost the ice cream, and that was devastating to me. I think more so than not having power or water. But all right, okay, guys. So that's going to do it for this evening. Now, remember, our next and our last live review is going to be Monday night, and Monday night I will do periods 8 and 9. So you guys have a fantastic evening. Thank you, Tatiana. I absolutely will. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you later. Good night.